to let people come on. I know we're waiting for some more. Am I right, Danny?
Yeah, but go ahead and start. It's after 10.
Okay, very good. We want to really welcome Rabbi Marla Feldman today. That's Feldman, not Feldman. And as we were just chatting, that the beauty of Zoom, that she can address so many of our women's groups without having to schlep and travel, especially in cold weather. And hopefully many of you will know that Rabbi Feldman was the executive director of WRJ since 2012 and recently retired in the summer of 2023. She has been in Jewish communal service for what? I forget how many, I won't say how many years because you're too young. But was director of development for URJ, director of the Commission of Social Action and Reform Judaism, a reform rabbi in New York, and a lawyer with her JD from the University of Florida. And while she has penned and written a number of articles that have been published in a variety of publications and newspapers, she is now a published author. And we are happy to hear her, this will be backwards, in her book, Biblical Women Speak, Hearing Their Voices Through New and Ancient Midrash. So we are looking forward, Rabbi, to hear how your book came about and a little bit about the book. And if you have questions, because we know that sometimes they pop up and you forget what they are, just put them in the chat. Danny will monitor, and then she will, if it's a question that's very pertinent right away, we'll interrupt. But we hope if you really want to ask a verbal question, wait till the end, or Rabbi Feldman will stop to give people a chance to ask a question. And I've spoken enough, and now I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Feldman.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's really great to be here. I'm going to share my screen, so give me just a moment to get this going here. And hopefully we'll get it so you see it in the right view. There we go. Okay.
That looks good on our end.
Perfect. That's great. So I just have to do one more thing on my end. So I can maybe see the chat. Did I just undo something? Or are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, no, we went back to
Okay, I
preview.
clicked on something wrong. Okay, how's this looking for you?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you again. It's great to be here, and very exciting for me to be able to talk about my book, as some of the people who I know on this call, and I'm glad you're on, they know I worked on this book for quite a while, and it really has been a passion project of mine. So very exciting for me to be able to talk about it. We are going to be doing a little bit of Torah study in a way. So although it's not a traditional text study, I think it's appropriate to begin with the blessing for studying together, which for those who don't know it, it begins with the same rubric as a typical prayer, but it ends with the words La'asok b'divrei Torah, praising God for the opportunity to be engaged in the study of Torah. So out loud or silently, however you do it in your own space, please join me. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. So, Biblical Women Speak, Hearing Their Voices Through New and Ancient Midrash. The first thing I'd like to do is take a few moments to talk about what Midrash is, so that we all have the same starting point. Some of you, I'm sure, already know, but bear with me as I give a little bit of background here. The word Midrash comes from the Hebrew root word that means to search out. And it describes what is a literary process, a unique Jewish literary process. It's not a particular book, it's a process of literature that develops as scholars, rabbis, sages probe the biblical text for deeper understandings. The biblical text in our tradition is sacred. It's the word of God. So of course we want to know the deepest level of meanings. And we presume that there's the basic level of meaning, but there's also probably hidden meanings. Also, because it's the word of God, there's nothing extraneous or redundant. And so every word is an opportunity to wrestle with the text, to probe it to gain a deeper understanding, to fill in some of the obvious gaps in the text, which is part of what I've done in my book. And also, it's a way of keeping our biblical text relevant for the modern era, whatever the modern era is. So when Rashi was working in France in the 11th century, he was trying to find relevance in the biblical text for his day and age, and Maimonides and other scholars throughout the Middle Ages and even in going back to the Talmudic period. So in every day and age, those who study our text are searching for those deeper meanings, for understanding the text in its most meaningful way. So you can find Midrash in numerous places. I mentioned the Talmud. There's Midrash in the Talmud. There's Midrash that we can find in translations. So there are ancient translations of the biblical text, the Aramaic translations going back to around the 1st century. There's Greek translations and Latin translations. And there were some stories that weren't in the biblical text, but were so well known that they ended up in these translations. So we can find Midrash in early translations. We can find Midrash in the medieval commentaries that were written. Over time, this large body of literature gets collected in different collections. So there are collections of Midrash, and there are collections of Midrash that are certain types of Midrash. So we'll take a minute just to talk a little bit about what do I mean by different types of Midrash. So depending on how Midrash comes about, they tend to be categorized. So for example, there are some questions that arise naturally from the narrative. We have the biblical stories, but there are logical questions that just jump out from the text that we want to know about. So one of the most classic, if you will, examples of that, you can raise your hand electronically or otherwise. How many of you, and I can't see all of you, but you can see each other, I hope. How many of you know the story of Abraham smashing his father's idols? A lot of you. So it is a very old, very common Midrash. It's not in the biblical text. And yet people know this story so well, they just, without reading, they assume it's in the biblical text. But it comes about naturally because we don't meet Abraham and Sarah until they're already adults. And yet we want to know more about their lives. How did they meet? And how did they grow up? And what was it about Abraham's background that led him to this unique understanding of God? And so the story evolves of him smashing his father's idols. So there's another type of midrashic literature that comes about as we wrestle with particular words. So an unusual word in the biblical text, or something that seems redundant. As I said, God doesn't have mistakes, right? So there must be a reason that there are two words. He went and he saw and he did. Those kinds of riffs in the biblical text are ripe for opportunities to ask the question, what do each one of these phrases mean? And there's another type of midrashic literature that develops as we probe for understanding things we have to understand, like the commandments. I think the easiest way to understand this is the commandment, you shall not work on the Sabbath day. So what do you need to know if you want to fulfill that commandment? You need to know what work is, right? So the commandment just says you shouldn't work on the Sabbath day, but we need to have the answer to that question in order to fulfill the commandment. So the rabbis applied rules of logic. There's a whole set of rules that go into Midrash. They applied rules of logic, and they saw that in a neighboring section of the biblical text, we have the description of the work, the same Hebrew word. So by analogy, a word used in one place can be analogous to a word used in another place. By analogy, they saw the word used for work in this juxtaposition, neighboring section, could be the same. So they outlined the work that was done for building the tabernacle, and they outlined 40 tasks, sewing and chopping and dyeing and so on. To this day, those who follow traditional law Jewish law will follow these, will look at these 40 tasks. This list of 40 that was developed very early on in Jewish history as the definition of what that's the work that shouldn't be done on the Sabbath day. So that's Midrash, but it's called Midrash Halacha. It's Midrash that has to do with the law and helps define the law. So that gives you some idea of some of the different types. And you can find collections of Midrash, narrative Midrash. You can find collections of halachic Midrash. Midrash also comes about in sermons. So when a rabbi weaves together different texts in a sermon, that's creating Midrash. It's creating those linkages. So there are collections of what they call homiletical Midrash. So now, as we enter the modern era, there's a new type of Midrash that's developing, and that's what I would call feminist Midrash. I don't know that it's a formal classification, but I think if it isn't, it will be. So it comes about, obviously, I think, because for all of these thousands of years of the development of Midrash, it was only men who were engaged in the process, in the studying of text in this way. And consequently, there were insights and understandings and the kinds of questions that women may ask that were missing from the biblical text. So you need this modern era when women now have the tools of the kingdom and now have the ability to study, to start engaging in this with the text in the same way that the rabbis and sages of the past did. But they will have unique insights and questions that they apply that the rabbis didn't apply. So I don't want to suggest that the rabbis were in any way lacking in creativity or insight. They had tremendous insight. And yet their experiences was not complete. The resource, what we have inherited is diminished because women's voices and women's experiences were missing. And I have to also add that for the most part, those who were engaged in studying our texts had an agenda. The agenda was to tell the story of the Israelite saga. And they told that story primarily through the lens of the protagonists, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. And so we read about Miriam, and we read about the matriarchs, and we read about other women, but they exist in many ways to move the storyline along for the protagonists. So, you'll hear me talk in a moment about Potiphar's wife, who's one of those characters. The rabbis didn't really care about who she was or why she was there. But if you remember the story, she tries to seduce Joseph, and as a result, he ends up in prison. Joseph has to get to prison because that's where Pharaoh becomes aware of his dream interpreting power. So her role in the text is to get Joseph to prison. So that's why she exists. And that's kind of the extent of the interest that the rabbis have in her, is her role vis-a-vis Joseph. Feminist Midrash will come along and say, wait a minute, who was she? What was her story? What do we learn from her? So that's this whole new genre of Midrash. And I don't want to suggest that in my book, Biblical Women Speak, I'm in any way unique in doing this. There's a whole body of feminist Midrash that is developing, and a whole lot of people who are engaged in doing exactly what I have done here. So in my book, which I'll start focusing on in a moment, I did a couple of different things and combined them in my book. I identified female characters that I wanted to think about, learn about. I did that probing on my own, looking at the biblical text, but also looking at the generations before me who wrestled with Midrash. I looked at commentaries, medieval commentaries. I looked at what was in the Talmud. What I didn't do, and admittedly, you need to be aware, I did not look at the modern era. I didn't look at what my contemporaries are doing on these. I really looked backwards. So I did kind of a survey of how these characters were perceived and what the Midrash was, going from basically the Talmudic period, the 1st century, through the medieval period. After that, you're kind of in the modern era. So I did look at some commentaries that were into the 16th, 17th, 18th century, but for the most part, it went through the medieval period. And then I explored how the questions that they asked. And by the way, if you want to engage in this study, looking at what they looked at in the past is really helpful in identifying what are some of the questions that arise out of the text. So they answered those questions in a certain way, and that developed the ancient Midrash. I answered the questions sometimes in a very different way and had developed my own Midrash as a result. And then I also looked at, for each of these characters, what I think we can learn from them and their story, at least as I've interpreted their story. So who are the women specifically that I looked at in the book? Well, before I move on, let me stop there for a moment. So that's the extent of the background on Midrash I'm planning to give you. But if there are questions related to what is Midrash or how it develops, this would be a good time to stop and see if there are any questions. No?
If anybody with questions could use the raise hand feature under their reactions, that'll be easier than me trying to see if anybody's holding up their hand in their little box.
Or put it in the...
Or put it in the chat. That works just as well.
Oh, I do see a comment about the artwork. So let me make a comment about that. In a way, art is a form of Midrash. So when an artist depicts a biblical scene, whether it was a medieval artist or a modern artist, they're imagining that scene in a certain way. The biblical text doesn't draw a picture of Miriam dancing with the timbrels by the water. So when an artist depicts that, the artist is depicting what they're wearing, how old they are, how the characters are relating to each other. So, another classic example of one of these narrative gaps that beg to be told, the question, how old was Isaac at the time of the binding of Isaac? Which is, the Akedah, when Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain and almost sacrifices him, which is a literary motif that comes up in art quite extensively. And there's a lot of art that forms connections, not just depicting the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, but makes connections to the story of Jesus. And so you'll see artistically depictions that morph these two stories together. But what we don't know from the narrative is how old was Isaac? So it's a classic question. You will see depictions in art of the Akedah with Isaac as an infant. You'll see depictions with Isaac as a preteen, 13 years old. You'll see Isaac depicted as a 30-some-year-old man. And that's, Jesus was 33 at the time of the crucifixion. And so that's one of the places where you see an artist as making a connection between those literary motifs. So art in many ways is a form of Midrash by definition, because the artist has to put some of their own view and their own imagination into that piece of art. So thanks for lifting that up. So if there are no questions about Midrash, then I will go on. And I also, let me ask Lynn, I will need a time check because I can't see the clock on my computer. So I think when we get to quarter of, give me a time check if it doesn't sound like I'm getting where I need to go. Okay, thanks. So who are the women that I focused on? There are, of course, women in the biblical text. Many are minor characters. A few, like the matriarchs and Miriam, are major characters. I tended to focus on those who were lesser known women in the biblical text, particularly some that didn't have a name. I mentioned the agenda of the rabbis in telling the Israelite story. Because of that, women who were not part of the Israelite family tree were not of particular interest. They and their descendants were not part of the continuing story of the Israelite people, and so they were just of passing interest. So I looked at some of the non-Israelite women in the biblical text, nameless women. I also looked at moments in the lives of some of the more well-known women, but moments in their lives that I thought particularly had something for us to learn about, if we could imagine how they dealt with those moments in their lives that the rabbis really didn't focus on. And also, as I wrote here, one of the things that I found intriguing is those who were really a blank slate, because then I think there's in some ways more room for creativity. So before I turn on to the next slide, So I'm going to ask a question. You can just think of the answer or raise your hand or do the raised hand. With the exception of those who have already read my book, how many of you have ever heard of Keturah, the biblical woman Keturah? Oh, Joe, I see that. Joe's like the only one I can see on my screen here. So I'm guessing there were very few hands raised. Surprisingly, Keturah is, okay, I'm trying to go on to my next slide. There we go. Keturah could have been a major character, but wasn't. There's only 6 verses in the biblical text that refer to her and her storyline. And yet she was married to Abraham, which is pretty shocking if you think about Abraham, our patriarch, had a wife that why don't we know her name? Why is she not talked about? Why are there only 6 verses? So the storyline comes about after the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And after Sarah dies, Abraham takes another wife whose name was Keturah. According to Midrash, the rabbis kind of plot out the chronology of the patriarchs and the biblical history. They would have been married 35 or 40 years. So that's a long time in the life of the patriarch that we're kind of ignoring, other than acknowledging that he was married to this woman named Keturah. In those 6 verses, we learned that she gives birth to 6 sons. Each one of the sons becomes the progenitor of a major other nation, non-Israelite nation. The Midianites is the one that you might have recognized. The son, and we don't know anything about their upbringing, their childhood. We don't know anything about who they were, how they related to Abraham's other sons, Isaac and Ishmael. We know that Abraham gives them gifts. We don't know what those gifts were, and he sends them to the east. But again, their descendants were not part of the Israelite lineage. The rabbis who talk about this story are not focused at all on Keturah, although some of them play on her name a little bit, but they're focused on questions about the sons, and particularly were they obligated for Jewish law, like in particular circumcision. So were they part of the kinsmen, if you would, that are somewhat obligated for the laws or not? That's what the rabbis were concerned about. But otherwise, they were largely ignored in classical sources. And Keturah also largely ignored. But bringing my sensibilities to the text, bringing my feminist lens to the text, I want to know who Keturah was. I want to know about her background. I want to know why she married Abraham, why Abraham wanted to marry her. I want to know how she raised her children. I want to know what her life was like. And I want to know about these 35 or 40 years in the life of Abraham and Keturah. So that's an example of a glaring gap in the text. And it is such a glaring gap, but where feminist Midrash comes in, the rabbis weren't occupied with filling that glaring gap. Feminist Midrash will fill that gap. Another woman that one would think we would know more about is Bat-Shua. She's not named. Bat-Shua means the daughter of Shua. So all we know about her is that she was the daughter of a Canaanite whose name was Shua. So she's referred to as Bat-Shua. She was married to Judah. Again, not just any one of the 12 tribes, but Judah. So we only have 12 verses about her. And there's a lot that happens in that 12 verses, but we don't really know much about her. So in those 12 verses, Judah, who was a shepherd, and his friend Hira comes up throughout the biblical text. He and Judah hang out together on numerous circumstances. So Judah and Hira travel to this town where they meet the Canaanite named Shua, and they meet his daughter. Presumably, Judah falls in love, is smitten, they get married, and in quick succession, she gives birth to 3 sons. When the eldest son is ready to be wed, Judah arranges a marriage to a woman named Tamar. You may recognize her name because the biblical story and the Israelite lineage continues through Judah and Tamar. But this is now just Bat-Shua's story. We don't know that's going to happen yet. Tamar marries the eldest, and the eldest dies. And then Tamar is given as a wife to the second son. So this is really the first case of levirate marriage from the biblical mandate of marrying your deceased husband's brother. And then he dies. And then Tamar is promised to the third son, but the third son isn't old enough. So Judah sends Tamar back to her family and until Shelah could grow up. And then Bathsheba dies. So all of that happens in 12 verses, which is a lot of information, but not a lot of detail. So as I said, the line of Judah will continue later in the story. You may remember Tamar tricks Judah into having relations with her, and then it's through Tamar and Judah's line that you eventually have the Messianic line and King David. But once again, we see that the rabbis really were not interested in, even though she was the wife of Judah and the mother of 3 of his sons, because the Israelite lineage did not continue with her, and she and her descendants were not part of the Israelite line, the rabbis just weren't particularly interested in her. They didn't give her a name. They didn't ask who she was or how they got married or how what their marriage was like. They didn't ask questions that really jump out at me. Questions like, we know that she was a Canaanite, lived and would have left her father's home to live this nomadic life in the Israelite clan. So what was her life like as an outsider? She was someone who joined the Israelite clan. So we might be able to make a connection between her story and those who convert to Judaism or align themselves with the Jewish people, even without converting. So what was her life like as an outsider living among the Israelites? How did she cope with the loss of 2 of her 3 sons? I mean, that's a powerful question. The rabbis didn't ask that. They didn't ask how Judah coped, and they didn't ask how the mother coped with that loss. Well, all of us deal with loss, and we know others who deal with loss. So as we imagine her life and her story and how she coped with loss, it might give us insights into dealing with those horrible kinds of circumstances that might happen to us or those we know. So I think there's much that we can learn in Bathsheba's story, but we have to be creative and imaginative and imagine her story in order to draw out those stories. So another woman who we actually know her name, but almost nothing about her. And I'm guessing, again, unless you read my book, I'm guessing you don't know her name, Shlomit Bat Dibri. Interestingly, she's the only woman who is given a name in the entire book of Leviticus. And yet her story also just a few verses. And the story really centers around her son, not her. So the only thing we know about Shlomit Bat Dibri, that her name is Shlomit Bat, daughter of Dibri, from the tribe of Dan. So we know she was from the tribe of Dan. This is a story that takes place in the wandering in the wilderness. She has a son who is half Israelite and half Egyptian. The son gets in a fight with someone. We don't know what the fight was about, commits blasphemy, and is stoned to death in the wilderness. So it becomes this infamous story of the blasphemer who is stoned to death in the wilderness. But there's nothing in the classical commentary or Midrash, there's bits and pieces, but not a lot, about his mother. So here she is, she's named, we know her name, but we don't know really anything about her and her part in this story. So of course we want to know, and the rabbis wrestled with what was the fight about, and why was he put to death? Why was it such a harsh punishment? Why did she have a name? They asked those kinds of questions, but we don't know her part of the story. We don't know how she came to have a child who was half Israelite and half Egyptian. Who was the father? So the rabbis do ask some of these questions, but they don't really imagine her story through the lens of her own life. So what I've tried to do in my Midrash is give her a story, speak in her voice of how she would have lived as the mother of someone who also might have been an outsider, might not have been accepted, might have been bullied, seen her son, who was perhaps troubled, wrestle with being an outsider, and then eventually being condemned by Moses and God. So it's a dramatic story, but we're really missing the drama of it by not looking at the story through her lens. modern Midrash gives us the opportunity to tell the story through her lens. So Leah is, there are a couple examples in the book of chapters of women like Leah and Miriam, who are major figures. Of course, we know a lot about Leah and Rachel. They were matriarchs. We know about that they were sisters. There's a thread in the Midrash that suggests they were twins, which helps explain the wedding night switch. You may remember where their father, Lavan, switches Rachel, who was beautiful and loved by Jacob. He worked 7 years to marry her, but on their wedding night, the father, Lavan, switches Rachel for Leah. So thinking of them as twins is one answer that the rabbis come up with to the question of how did Jacob not know that it was Leah in his bed and not Rachel. So we know about that wedding night switch. We know that among the two sisters, there was a rivalry for having children. We know that Rachel couldn't have children, and so she gives her handmaid Bilhah to Jacob to have children on her behalf. Leah then does that with her handmaid Zilpah. So we know these elements of their story. Eventually, once their clans have grown, they leave their father's home and they travel with Jacob back to Jacob's homeland. And then on the road, Rachel dies, giving birth to Benjamin. Interestingly, we never hear from or about Leah after that point, as if the moment when Rachel died, Leah died also. We just don't hear, or as if her character only exists in relation to Rachel. And of course, Rachel is the mother of Joseph, through whom the storyline will continue in the succeeding verses. So I have to confess, and I can't see who's on the call, so I don't know if my folks have joined or not, but I am also a twin and an older twin. And so I tend to identify with Leah and that thread that suggests that they were twins. Consequently, I want to see the story through the lens of her life. She was unloved. She was the older sister, but she had lots of children. So her clan was full, but her heart was not. And then you have this moment when Rachel dies, and we don't hear anything from Leah in that moment. So I want to know what that moment was for Leah. So in my Midrash, which is called Leah's eulogy, it's Leah's eulogy for her sister, Rachel. What would she have said? What would she have thought? Had they come to a meeting of the minds, the two women? Had they, by the end of their lives, had they found common purpose? Had they resolved their childhood issues? Or were those issues still coming between them? How did she feel in that moment? And why don't we hear anything from her? So those are some of the questions that I ask as a woman, as an older twin, bringing myself and my own life experiences to the text, which is what we're allowed to do through Midrash. So Bilhah, I just mentioned a moment ago, is one of those two handmaids. I knew I wanted to tell the story of the handmaids and ask questions like, how did they come to be handmaids? How did they deal with this family situation, this very unusual family situation? How did they deal with being mothers of some of the 12 tribes, but not being considered matriarchs? How did they feel being passed around for their wombs? So there were a lot of questions about them. And then the reason I chose Bilhah is because there's a really interesting one-liner in the biblical text. Comes about as a non sequitur. It's kind of in the middle of a different story. And there's just this one-liner that says, Reuben, who was Leah's eldest and the first of the 12 tribes, lay with Bilhah. And of course, that's a metaphor for having sexual relations. So it's just this one-liner, and you have to read it and pause and say, what is that about? What, that this is her stepson, that, what, so the rabbis, of course, asked the question, what's happening in that moment? Was it rape? Was it love? Just like in art, and you can see this depiction of Reuben and Bilhah in the art. How old were they? Was there an age difference between them or not? So how is the artist depicting this moment? This artist is depicting it as a lover's tryst. So, others depict it as rape. So that's all Midrash. But that actually, to me, made Bilhah a much more interesting character. And just to illustrate the benefit of looking at the classical texts and not just, making it up as we go along. So I found in the Midrash a very minor thread that I actually hadn't known about, a very minor thread that I actually hadn't known about when I started doing research about Bilhah. And the thread comes about later in the biblical text in the Joseph narrative. And you may remember Joseph ends up in Egypt and there's a famine and the brothers come and Joseph welcomes them after, a few other incidents between them. And then in Egypt, so the brothers are all there in Egypt, Jacob, the father, dies. And the brothers are worried that now that Jacob has died, maybe Joseph isn't going to be so forgiving. And so the brothers send a messenger to Joseph, and they tell the messenger, tell Joseph that Jacob, our father, said that he should forgive us. So that's actually in the biblical text. The Midrash on that story asks a question, who was the messenger? As I said, there's a minor thread in the text that suggests that Bilhah was the messenger, or an alternative thread that it was Bilhah's sons. So the rabbis note a special relationship between Bilhah and Joseph might have taken place because Bilhah was his mother, Rachel's handmaid. And after Rachel died, they imagined that Joseph and Benjamin actually went to live with Bilhah, their mother's handmaid. So they presume a special relationship between Bilhah and Joseph. There's also a thread that develops in Midrash that Bilhah is the only one of the 4 wives of Jacob that goes down to Egypt, that survives and travels to Egypt, and that she becomes the caregiver for Jacob in his old age. So you have all of this potential storyline of the relationship between Jacob and this particular one of his wives, Bilhah, between Bilhah and Joseph, and this thread of her being the message. So in my Midrash, I picked up those different threads, and my Midrash is the letter that she sent to Joseph. So it becomes her message looking back on her life. It answers those questions about how she came to be a handmaid and how she felt about that. All of that gets woven in through the hook, if you will, the literary hook of that message to Joseph. So as you can tell, this is one I particularly like in the stories. So Miriam, of course, is perhaps the most well-known biblical woman. But here again, there's a moment in her life that I think really has gotten short shrift. You may remember, this is also a story in the wilderness. Aaron and Miriam go to Moses and they criticize him, something to do with his wife. It's not entirely clear what the criticism is, but God becomes so angry at the audacity of Miriam and Aaron challenging God's chosen prophet that God strikes Miriam down with leprosy. Of course, logical question, why Miriam and not also Aaron? Aaron then pleads to Moses to intercede on behalf of their sister. He offers what becomes a very famous prayer, El Na Rafanala, oh God, pray heal her. You may know this prayer. It's become the focus of many healing prayers and songs that we have during services. You may have heard it. And then Miriam is sent out of the camp for 7 days. And she's then declared able to come back to the camp after her leprosy is cured. She comes back and the Israelites move on. Much to my surprise, there's virtually nothing in the classical Midrash that asks the question, what happened to her in these 7 days? Where did she go? What experience did she have? How did she cope with being isolated and sent away just at a time when she needed her community and her brothers the most? She's sent to deal with this crisis on her own. And then she comes back and they just move on, and no one asks, including the rabbis, no one asked what happened to her. What did she learn? Did she learn anything? Was she changed in any way in coming back? So depending on our time, if we have time, I'll do a little bit of reading from that Midrash. That's Miriam's Fringes. So I want to know and fill in that gap. Those of you who do Torah study in the summer, you may have heard this story. The story of Tzlafachat's daughters. It comes in the Torah cycle reading in the summer, so a lot of people miss this if they're not going to services over the summer. It's a relatively famous story and one that we take great pride in. It's just as the Israelites are ending their wilderness journey, they're about to go into the land, and so they're doing the land grant based on tribes. Tzlafachat had died in the wilderness, and his 5 daughters, they had no sons, and it was through the men that the inheritance went. So the 5 daughters go to Moses and the elders and say, our father didn't have a son, so don't disinherit our clan, let us inherit. So much to our pride, the answer was yes, that the women could inherit. So we pat ourselves on the back and we think about how progressive our ancient tradition was. But there was a proviso. The women had to marry within their tribe. So it was a restriction that wasn't placed on anyone else. Marriage among the tribes was permitted with this exception. So I wanted to explore, and the rabbis didn't ask this question either. I wanted to explore what would be the impact on one of these 5 sisters if they didn't want to marry someone within their tribe, or if they were in love with and wanted to marry someone from another tribe. It also, I think, is a reality check. Yes, there was a progressive nature in our tradition that allowed it, but in effect, they didn't allow the women to inherit. They allowed the inheritance to pass through them to their male heirs, either their husband or their children, who would be from the clan, from that tribe. So it wasn't really, they weren't really inheriting. They were only inheriting as a pass-through to the males. So it's still progressive in its time. But yet there are still questions that I want to ask that the rabbis didn't ask because they weren't particularly interested in the day-to-day life of some of these women. So I mentioned earlier some of the non-Israelite women. I mentioned the story of Potiphar, Potiphar's wife. Again, she's unnamed. And as I explained before, Potiphar was a minister of Pharaoh, so you presume that she was a noble woman. We know that Joseph was a servant in their household, and she tries to seduce him. And you know the rest of the story, he ends up in prison. The question, the presumption of the rabbis in the classical Midrash is that she did something bad to Joseph, our ancestors, and therefore she must have been an evil woman. There must be something bad in her nature. So there's an assumption there. And I come with a different assumption. So the question that I'll ask, which is not, a couple of the rabbis asked this question, but it wasn't a main thread. What would possess a noble woman to seek love in the arms of a foreign servant? What was it in her background that so corrupted her understanding of love that she sought it in such a corrupt way? So when you start with a different question like that, which again is a question that anyone could ask, but it was generally a question that was missing in the traditional Midrashic sources, you might find that her character becomes one worthy of pity rather than condemnation. So then you have the story, the Exodus story, which we're in the midst of this Exodus story now in our weekly cycle of readings. Shifra and Puah, who of course are the midwives, Pharaoh's daughter, who doesn't have a name, and her servant, who also doesn't have a name. Interestingly, her servant is mentioned in the text, so she is a character in the biblical text, but virtually ignored. When Pharaoh's daughter is in the Nile and she sees the basket with, we know, Moses floating in it, she sends her servant to scoop up the basket. And so technically it's the servant who saves Moses. So here again, I want to pick up that thread, that unknown character, and look at who was the servant. Why was she there in the Nile with Pharaoh's daughter? Why was she the one to save Moses? So, and I see your hand, Lynn. Is that my 15-minute warning? Thank you. So in all of these stories, there's a debate, at least with Shifra and Puah among the rabbis, if they were Egyptian midwives or Hebrew midwives, because it says they were Hebrew midwives, which could mean they were midwives to the Hebrew women, or they were Hebrew women who were midwives to the Hebrew women. The rabbis debate that question quite a bit. I chose to align my thinking with those who said, out of logic, Pharaoh wouldn't have gone to Hebrew midwives to say kill Hebrew babies, nor would Pharaoh have known Hebrew midwives, but he would know the Egyptian midwives who served the court and others in the capital city where Pharaoh was. And so my story really looks at them as Egyptian women, which leads me to questions: what would empower women who were generally disempowered to defy their king? And what would compel these women not only to defy their king, but to save foreign slaves? What was it in their upbringing, in their understanding of ethics as Egyptian women? So I think there's a lot that we can learn about civil disobedience and ethics and righteousness that's going to be different if we see them as fully Egyptian God worshippers, small g God worshippers, than if we see them as people like us. I think it helps us really expand our thinking. So overall, as you've heard, what I try to do is find relevance in these ancient stories by asking questions that maybe weren't always asked, by answering the questions, filling in the gaps in a way that resonates for me, given the questions that I'm asking. And my hope is that in reading the book, I will help empower all of you, the readers, to similarly be creative, to stop and read the text slowly, to let those questions rise up in the text, and then to creatively try to answer those questions. I think it's okay to bring our baggage to the text. What are our experiences, and how do we put ourselves in their shoes to imagine their lives? And once we do that, and I think that's reading the text with Midrashic eyes, then I think we will find so much more in the text, and we can help make it relevant for our own lives. So I'm going to stop there, see if there are any questions, and then if we have a few minutes left, I'll do a little bit of a reading.
Would you maybe like to take down the screen share so that we can see each other for this part of the discussion?
I would be happy to do that. Here we go.
Thank you. Susan Cohen wrote a question into the chat a little bit earlier. Susan, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I was just wondering what your process is for finding information to fill in these gaps of what we don't know.
Yeah, the good news is we live in an era when almost everything has been translated, number one. Number two, almost everything is available online. So there's a resource I want to share with all of you called Sefaria, Sefaria. Sefaria, is it .com or .org? I'm not sure. It's either .com or .org. And
Yeah.
it provides a beautiful resource. You could go to the biblical text, you could go to Talmudic text, you could go to any of these texts. You click on it, and it will give you every place that one verse of the Bible appears in the Talmud, appears in classical commentaries, appears in Midrash, which it's thousands of years of resources with the click of a button. So I have to say I use that resource quite a bit. That's if you're starting, like in the case of Bilhah, I said I knew I wanted to look at her as a character. So I started by looking at all of the references to Bilhah and what the rabbis have said in the commentary. And then I also looked at the section of the biblical text and looked at how in the classical Midrash, those storylines were viewed. Out of that, as I described, I picked up different threads in a story, kind of wrote itself, really, putting the threads together in a different way, imagining her story a little bit differently, and finding the hook to tell her story through this letter to Joseph. It really kind of wrote itself by that point. There are other stories that I approach differently, and if you read the book, I think you'll find that it's very different. The story of Shifra and Puah, of course, that became Puah and Shifra, and Pharaoh's daughter and the servant become two parts of a story, of a saga, really. in that case, just in reading the biblical text and asking the question, how did they have the wherewithal to defy Pharaoh? What would, where did that come from? In just wrestling with those questions, their story, maybe I watched too much television, I don't know, but their story became, kind of a story of court intrigue and conspiracy, a conspiracy of women. So that was one of the few midrashim that I wrote the midrash before doing the research. So I had this storyline in mind of this conspiracy of midwives that, I think I maybe had seen The Handmaid's Tale on TV or, whatever. So, these things are ruminating in my mind. And then I went back and looked at the classical midrash and filled in and it took on slightly different shape. But, the servant, in reading the text, I shouldn't say we all, many of us read the same stories year after year after year, and we tend to skim over things. But when you stop and you read it really slowly and carefully, different things will jump out at you. So I had read the story 1,000 times, but I never really noticed the servant. When you read it really slow, it's like, oh, she sent her servant in. It's like, oh, well, wait, who is she? There's another character in this story that I had never thought about. So then she becomes part of this conspiracy. And, imagining her life as a servant and what her relationship to Pharaoh's daughter was. And then, so the whole story evolved. And then in reading some of the classical Midrash, and by the way, not just Midrash, I also looked at, you may have heard of Josephus, who was a historian from the 1st century. And basically, as a historian, he was retelling the biblical history. And there's midrash that comes up in his writings in what we call the intertestamental literature, which is the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, which are early 1st century writings that were, in some cases, as old as the biblical text, but did not make it into the biblical canon. Tons of midrash there. So I saw a midrash that Pharaoh's daughter was barren. And suddenly it became a different story. The idea of her taking a Hebrew child becomes a very different story if you add that layer that she was barren. So that gives you some insights of, how they develop. Bottom line, it's really living with the characters, reading deeply, slowly, carefully, wrestling with it, seeing how others have looked at these texts in the past, and just cogitating, letting these things percolate until their stories emerge. Thank you for the question. It's a great question.
You also put a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it?
Yes, thanks, Danny. Well, what I said is there's a contemporary Israeli story, maybe from 20 years ago now, but I don't remember the author's name, in which Miriam, when she's exiled with the leprosy, is given a tent somewhere in the wilderness, and the only person who comes to support her or help her, bring her food, is Zipporah, the wife of Moses. And ultimately, Miriam grows very bitter. The leprosy does not go away, and she dies there. She writes her story down and dies
Yeah.
there. I was wondering if you're familiar with any.
I am not familiar with it, but it comes from the same place of asking that question. What happened to her during those 7 days? Now, I do have to say that there are some rules to Midrash. And while you can be really creative, it's a little unusual to contradict the biblical text. So in the biblical text, she does come back,
Yes.
and we learn that she dies much later. So I'd be interested in how that author kind of made that shift. But yeah, it's perfectly legitimate. It's a different way of answering the question, what happened to her? In my story, if you read the book in the different chapters, you will have read the story of Shlomit, the mother of the blasphemer, which is kind of her rant on how could this happen and what kind of God would allow my son to be, would not just allow, but command that my son should be killed. So it's, I think, an honest reflection of the anger that this woman would have had, also looking back on her life and the challenges that she had. So in my story of Miriam's fringes, when she's exiled, she meets Shlomit, who also is among the exiles. And they have a conversation together. So that in a way links, two of my midrashim together. Lynn, I see your hand.
I have a quick question. So with every chapter, I kept saying, oh, this is my favorite. This is my favorite. But honestly, towards the end with Miriam and Shlomit, I was sitting there saying, if only this really would have happened, what a humane show this would have been for Miriam, who, isn't always, as I've said to you before we got on the call, like other women aren't always treated so well. So that to me was a nice connection. But what led you to that connection?
Interestingly, the whole connection with Shlomit was not originally there. And I have to acknowledge my twin, Pamela. By the way, she's an artist, and one of the artistic depictions, in fact, I think it was Shlomit, it's her piece of art. So she was my reader, every chapter she read, and she's a good critic, she's a loving critic. And she pointed out that it wasn't personal enough. I talked about Miriam's experiences, but it was very distant. She saw these other people who were with her in the outskirts of the camp. And she really pointed out that, where's the dialogue? You need to hear her voice more than just what she's seeing. And I needed that prompting from her. And I don't know, I think I dreamt it and woke up the next morning saying, oh, it's Shlomit, right? Like, here's another character that resonates for me. So I put them together. I can't tell you like what inspired me to find that connection, but it worked. It really worked once I, developed it. So you never know where your inspiration will come. But again, it comes from putting ourselves in the text. And any of you can do this too. When you read the text and you ask the question, you said, Lynn, wouldn't it be nice if this is what really happened? Well, think about that in our own day and age. We know that there are people wrestling with terrible things in their lives, hurts and pains and illness and loss. Are they isolated and dealing with them on their own, or are they surrounded with a community? And when we ask those questions, we really can find relevance in these stories for ourselves, and maybe even inspiration of things that we might do differently in our own lives.
Okay, Danny, do we have time for one last question?
It's 10:59, so yes.
Okay.
Does anybody else have a question for? Okay, I'll ask a question then. So
before I turn it, no, okay. Before I
wait, I want to ask a question.
Say,
can I ask a question?
Rabbi,
no.
Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
Okay, so my question that I've been thinking about is, I was looking at all the ancient Midrash, and some of it gets fairly outlandish in that, like, Shifra and Pua never existed at all. They're just like Yocheved and Miriam under different names, or like the daughter of Pharaoh's servant's arm stretches out several cubic meters to retrieve Moses from the reeds. How did you decide which pieces of Midrash to take seriously or to engage with over the stuff that you chose to just like note was there, but not?
Yeah. As I said, there are rules. They're called the homiletical rules. But even within those rules, you can get some pretty outlandish things. So the arm stretching out comes about because there's an unusual phraseology that's used. So the rabbis, again, no word is extraneous. So when looking at this word, what does this word really mean? Well, it could mean this, it could mean that. And so that her arm stretched out. So, there was a logical place that it came from, even if the answer was somewhat outlandish. One of I talked about this in the background of that chapter, the question of whether they were Egyptian or Hebrews. There were some who assumed that they were Hebrew. If you assume that they were Hebrew midwives, the next logical question is, well, who were they? And so the rabbis say, well, they were Yocheved and Miriam, or in some cases, they were Yocheved and Elisheva, who was Aaron's wife. So there's variations on that Midrash. And then the storyline flows from there. And some of that comes from people looking through their own lens of their own day and age. You know, if you're living in a time and a place where the foreigners, I shouldn't say the foreigners, the ruling clans midwives would never have defended you, you're not going to see them as Egyptian women. You're going to presume they had to have been Hebrew women, because that's who we know, and that's who would have saved the Hebrew babies. And then again, you ask who they were. So there is a very early, very strong thread in the Midrash that says the midwives were Yocheved and Miriam. And so when I chose to align my thinking with those who said that they were Egyptian, I nonetheless wanted to bring in that linkage to Yocheved and Miriam. Consequently, they appear also as midwives, but not the midwives who were, and they were midwives that saved Israelite babies, but they weren't the midwives that Pharaoh talked about, because the logic of it made sense to me that Pharaoh would only have known Egyptian midwives. So some of that is what works in my story. Some of it is what makes sense to me. You know, one of the other outlandish stories is the story of that Pharaoh had a dream and it's a whole long, lengthy dream that, but ultimately that an Israelite or a Hebrew boy would be born who would usurp him. It's a classical literary motif. We see it in the Oedipus, we see it in other ancient mythologies, this myth of the son overthrowing the father, right? So there is, I brought in that thread because it worked in my story, even though it's a bit outlandish, but very well known and very common thread. So there isn't a single rhyme or reason, but what, you know, as I described that, cogitating about all those things together, some of those midrash find their way in and some get rejected.
So I do have another last question. I'm sure it's like asking if you have a favorite child, but of all the midrash that you developed in your book, which one was the most intriguing for you?
It is like asking, do I have a favorite child? So the short answer, there isn't one favorite, but you can tell in my describing them, there are some that I get a little bit more jazzed about. Bilhah is one, because in some ways, and it may sound a little hokey, but I kind of feel like I discovered her, you know, like it's not my story, it's her story. And that's actually the essence of Midrash. It's what we discover in the text. And we presume that it is there. It was always there. It just takes our probing to discover it. So we're not making it up. So I think Bilhah is one whose storyline really works. And in that case, the way I depicted the moment with Reuven and Bilhah, it's different than the way any of the rabbis looked at that moment. And yet it really works in the text, especially when you look at other related texts. Where was Reuven coming from? He was coming from what was happening with Joseph. And so, you know, there were other things that informed my depiction of that moment. And it really works, I think. Literarily, it works, and yet was really unique. Talafahad's daughters, I picked the second daughter, who's Noah, because in the biblical text, the way they named the 5 daughters switches, and the second one ends up last in some places and second in other places. So that just made her a more interesting character. So that story is like it's a love story. That's actually the name of it. So it is, again, maybe I see too many movies, but it's a kind of a classic unrequited love story. Well, it's not unrequited, it's unfulfilled love story. But it also really works that throughout the Midrash, I'm tracking the actual biblical text and what's happening. And so the flow of that Midrash really works in the flow of the biblical text. So it just really makes sense to me, how this storyline unfolds. So there isn't one favorite, but there are some that I kind of feel like I helped find their voice.
I love it. Before I turn it over to Rabbi Feldman, I just want to share with you a couple of upcoming dates. Our next board meeting, so there's no confusion, is February 4th. And because on February 11th, we are co-hosting a Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month brunch that will feature The Arts Knows No Boundaries. On February 12th, we have a cooking class with Carolyn Schwartz. And on February 15th, we're going to have a Galentine happy hour. All the details will be upcoming, not only in highlights, but in our WoTS weekly emails. And then February 25th is our Kugel cook-off. We need Kugel cookers and we need volunteers to help with the event. And now to Rabbi Feldman.
First things first, so Rabbi Feldman, thank you very much for writing this book. Your library, like mine, is filled with books, and there are precious few female voices in there. And to have another one added to the collection is vitally, vitally important. That's before we even start the topic, and the topic itself desperately needs more female voices. So thank you. I have already started teaching from it, and I look forward to using the book more. Just a very quick word. Rabbi Feldman has a connection to Pittsburgh, but comes to us today through the Jewish Book Council. Temple Sinai is part of the Jewish Book Council, which allows us to connect with authors from all over the Jewish world. If you would like to buy a copy of Rabbi Feldman's book, Danny still has a few copies available. And so they're available in the office. We also have a copy in our library. And so get a hold of the book and get a chance to read it if you haven't already. It's a wonderful addition to the Jewish library, and a really necessary one. So Rabbi Feldman, thank you for joining us, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Feldman. Thank you, everybody, for spending your Sunday morning with us.
Thank you all. It was great to be with you. Lynn, do you need me to stay on, or are we good?
I think we're good.
We're good. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us.
It's been a pleasure.
I encourage people to read the book. I really did.
Read the book.
Thank you.
Marla,
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we didn't have time, but I think the questions to make them read the book.
Yeah.
Marla, you grew up in
It was great. It was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Rabbi, what were you asking me?
Did you grow up in Pittsburgh? I know your parents are here.
No, I'm sorry they didn't join. My father married Ellie Baker, and they met in Florida. They both were widowed and they met in Florida. So they've been married, gosh, over 25 years already.
Awesome.
But no, I grew up in Toledo, Ohio.
Ah, nice. Aaron Meyer, who's the rabbi where your father belongs, is a close friend, and we were back and forth all the time. And Aaron said to me, "How did you get my member's kid before I did?"
Well, tell him he can have me too. I'm available.
So it's a very small world. Aaron Meyer is the son of one of my friends from BBYO days, who was from Sharon and I was from Newcastle, PA. So we are definitely amused by that.
Yeah.
Because there are only like 2 degrees of separation
Right.
on any given moment.
Right. And Rabbi, as I was sharing with Danny and Lynn, actually Ellie's kids do belong to Sinai, and they go to Sinai for part of the high holidays every year. That's David Baker and Sharon Dilworth are members of Sinai.
Sure.
So
do they report back on whether the sermons are coherent?
They did not, but I'm
That's
sure
because
they were.
they're never coherent when Rabbi Feldman.
They did not report back, and I'm sure the sermons were coherent.
Next time you're in town, let us know. We'd love to have you visit.
Absolutely.
I do come periodically. If I'm able to
has extra bedrooms.
Yes, yes, we do. And in Florida too, just saying.
Yeah, actually, you could have more than a minion just in sunny western Florida.
South
Between
Florida.
Sarasota
Oh, yes.
and Naples and the corridor.
Right.
Nice.
For sure. All right, everybody. Thank you again. Thank you so much, Rabbi Feldman. I really and I enjoyed the book.
What a great way to
Um,
start a Sunday morning.
Yeah, it was, and I loved to hear how you derived everything. So it was
Thanks.
wonderful.
Thanks.
All
All right, bye
I'm
everyone.
gonna kick everyone
Have a
off
good day.
now.
All
Have a great rest
right,
of your day, everybody.
bye. Great to see you all.